Good morning, everyone. I'm going to go through a PowerPoint. It's our last PowerPoint. It's on the grid in art. And then I'm going to go through the final assignment. And it is a grid composition that we're going to be doing. And I will run through that for you. So the first thing I'm going to go through is the grid composition in art. Now, we've dealt with everything so far. We've dealt with the elements of art: line, shape, value, texture, and color. The organizing principles on how we arrange those things on the picture plane. We've talked about the quality of line and what line can do as far as storytelling goes. We've talked about what shapes mean and how they work. We've talked about abstraction and how we think about things in general terms before we get specific. So you should, for any composition, you should reduce it to its essential set of characteristics, a reduction to essential forms like we did on the abstraction assignment. We've talked about gestalt and how you can use that to enhance focal point, and we've talked about focal point. There's many things we've talked about this semester, and it all comes into play with the grid as well. So grid composition in art. The grid forms the foundation of a lot of artwork. Sometimes it's so well hidden that you don't notice the grid. In other pieces, it's very obvious. So this goes back to our first assignment, the anatomy of a painting. Those harmonic decompositions that we did in that assignment are essentially grids that artists laid things out on. And that's the modern way to lay things out on your picture plane as well. You can plan things out according to a grid. It'll give you a lot of organization in your designs. So what is a grid? It's a grid subdivides a page or a picture plane vertically, horizontally into margins, columns, intercolumn spaces, lines of type, spaces between blocks of type and images. And the subdivisions form the basis of a modular and systematic approach to the layout. This works well with multi-page presentations, making the design process quicker and ensuring visual consistency between related picture planes. And that would be like books or web pages or a multi-page document. A grid is used for organization within your composition. So the one we talk about the most in this class is the rule of thirds. And the rule of thirds is basically a 3x3 grid. It's 3 equal divisions across and down, making 9 grid quadrants, I guess you would call them. It makes 9 of them total. So the thing to keep in mind is placing the elements in the rule of thirds. You place them on the intersections of the lines or according to lines, and that'll make your composition pleasing and more organized. So this composition is based on a grid, and it is the rule of thirds. You can kind of see it when you look at it, but when I lay this grid over it, you can see it's fairly obvious. So he's given importance to this figure by centering it and putting it in the center, and this one as well. But he's laid the eyes of this figure along that third, so we really notice it. And also he's placed all the objects in this according to the grid. So there's a symmetry happening, and it's well planned out. So you can make a grid, and once the grid's established, it's up to the designer as to when and how to break out of it. It doesn't mean the grid will be completely ignored. Instead, elements may cross over from column to column, extend to the end of the page, or extend onto adjacent pages. So when you're breaking out of the grid, you can lead to the most interesting page designs. You'll see this quite often in modern magazines or comic books or things of that nature. So here's a good example of a grid composition being used effectively in art. So you have your quadrants of the grids. You place things along those quadrants in the grids, but you can also give more attention to certain things in the grid by assigning more quadrants to what you're trying to show. So in this case, we're seeing this button here with blood on it, and then we're backing out, and then we're backing out further. We're backing out further, further, and further. There's a nice even rhythm to these panels. And then we get here, and this artist wants you to notice what's going on in this panel by backing out fully. It works really well, and it's quite effective. And there's another interesting thing about this panel. When you are reading a comic book, you turn the pages, you read the panels in order. But when you get to this panel, it stops you because we read from left to right in Western in the Western world, we read from left to the right. But this has the figure looking back into the scene, and all the directional forces are leading down to the left side of the panel. And what is happening here is this is blocking us and making us ponder on this panel before we turn the page. And that's all through design. Now, I like to show this as far as a grid composition goes because it's a multi-page comic book story, and there's really an effective use of design and some very cool design elements in these pages. So we'll go through them now. So when you look at this, there's a grid composition. This is based on a 4x4 grid. And if you look closely, you can see it. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. Every page in this story is a 4x4 grid arrangement. Now, you can see on this page that he broke outside of the grid by putting this in little insert panel here. And that's creating a focal point. He also took this and gave a lot of emphasis to this, but he also offset it so you'd really notice it, okay? And that's all based on the grid. So what is going on here is he's listening to the news, or no, this is Two-Face, talking to some people. It really doesn't matter, but you go through the panels fairly quickly. There's a pacing going on and a rhythm going on that goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then it's interrupted. This nice even pacing is interrupted by this panel, which is basically this news person reading the news. And we see Batman, that's Batman, by the way, Bruce Wayne, sitting in his study and talking to Alfred and saying goodnight. So it's late in the evening, he's listening. But there's an even rhythm that's broken up. So we go to the next page. And now we see Batman, and it gets in a little closer on him, so that's really a good design element too. Like, he's moving the camera in and out, and it's making us concentrate on Bruce Wayne. And he's listening to the news. He's thinking about, or it's talking about Zorro, and he gets kind of annoyed by Zorro, but then he gets in close, and we see something happening here. It's a transitioning to a memory. And there's something cool this artist does. His name's Frank Miller, by the way, and this is from The Dark Knight Returns. Something cool he does with color. We see cool colors here, and then we get warm here. So this is obviously a different place and time compared to this. So he's remembering back, and he's remembering Zorro because it's mentioned in the news story. And what that is I think everybody knows that, like, the Batman story is his parents get murdered by a criminal. And that's what makes him become Batman. So this is him remembering that night. They went to see Zorro, and they're getting out of Zorro. And he's having, like, a horrible look on his face. And it's pretty cool, too, because, like, the close-up, we see we're looking in his thoughts. This is inside his head, and this is inside his head and his memories. So you'll see when we get to here, it still has that same color scheme, so we know we're looking in the past. Young Bruce is dancing around pretending he's Zorro. Then he notices a bat. That's foreshadowing of the future, of course. But all these are paced, so you go bang, 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 bang. And then you kind of pause here because the contrast, the yellow and the green. And then we go bang, 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 bang. Really even until we get here and we see his dad shove Bruce. And then we have the gun pointing back into the picture plane. And that's a directional force that keeps us on the page and lets us ponder it for a minute. And this is all based on a grid. That's the thing I'm trying to point out here, but I want to show you the good design elements as well. So we see young Bruce, his hands coming forward, or this is his dad's hand coming forward to fight the criminal, and we see him reach up to the criminal. And then we get a close-up of the gun, and this is really cool too, because there's an even pacing here. But when we get in real close, this is a moment-to-moment action. And he does it in slow motion. So the trigger is pulled to slow motion here. We see the hand of Thomas Wayne on Bruce's chest. And then we see this. He kind of clutches the chest. And the thing that's going on here, we see this panel right here. He's showing something with this panel without actually showing it. This is the exact moment of his father's death. So that's when the bullet hits him and kills, or the bullet hits him here and he dies here because of the separation of those two shapes from one another. And that's all in design and the storytelling. Obviously, it's a picture of things, but it's backed up with the design of the shapes and the arrangement of the shapes. And then we see the gun again, and then we see his mother coming in, and the guy goes for his mother's pearls and hits her with the gun. And then Bruce remembers the pearls getting stretched out. And then we see the horror on his face. So if you look at the pacing caused by the grid, we got a nice even pacing here. It continues here, and then it's interrupted by the horror of his thoughts. And then we see the trigger. We see the pearls stretch their limit, and then we see the horror on his face. And then we look here, and this is the exact moment of his mother's death. And that's told by the design too, without actually showing the murder. And I think it's a pretty interesting design element. But again, it's the even pacing of the grid that is being interrupted here. And then we have a jarring thing because it's not part of the scene and it's back in modern times. So the color changes slightly to a more realistic color. And we're back in the news. And then we see Bruce flipping channels, and there's a really quick pacing here caused by the grid. He's divided the 4 panels in a row into 8 panels. So you read through this quickly. It gives you a quick read. And then it goes out again and passes to Bruce remembering again. And this is him flipping channels and can't get away from the memory. And then we go to here, and those pearls are getting stretched. So this is the last moment of his mother's life that he's remembering, and he's very saddened by it. And we get a close-up. He gets distracted, okay? So he has to leave. And we see that he leaves his study, and there's more emphasis given to these 8 panels for a single panel. He's given 4 quadrants for a single panel to put more emphasis on that panel. So again, the grid's putting emphasis on the panel. And then we switch back to him in the shower, remembering. We stop for a moment and ponder on this because contrast makes us really notice this. So the thing I want you to keep in mind, the grid, contrast, value, directional forces, focal point, color, everything we've talked about, essential forms, they're all being used to tell the story really effectively, and it's all based on that grid. So he remembers the shot. He remembers the water. He remembers the moment of his father's death. Then in horror, in sadness, he remembers the exact moment of his mother's death. And that's all told in design, and it's genius the way it's done. It's done with the elements, as well as being a picture of things. It's told with the shapes and elements quite effectively. And then we cut back to him in his study. He's returned to his office or study or whatever it is. And this is a really cool panel because just the design of this panel reinforces the narrative, because we see Bruce Wayne trapped by his memories, and this looks like a jail cell. So he's barred in, and we have the Gestalt principle of containment holding him in there, okay? And it puts emphasis on the figure itself. And then we see him listening to his answering machine in his office. And that jail is reinforced by these bars. He's trapped. You see him behind the bars. He's trapped. Then it cuts back to him, and he's listening to more messages. And then we look outside. These are the bars. We see something outside. And what do we see outside? We see the bat, there's Bruce Wayne. And then we get that mirrored on his face. And this is kind of cheesy, but it shows the bars of the window. And his eyebrows are kind of the same shape as the bat. So that's a repetition of form, and they relate to each other. But then we go into a close-up of Bruce Wayne. That shape is mirrored in this shape. So we see a relationship between the two. We have the bars. We have the bars coming across his face. We have the bars by themselves here. And then we have the bat crashing through. And this right here, we got an even pacing here. And then it's interrupted by 4 panels being dedicated to this giant, kind of bat creature crashing through the window. And this isn't a literal thing. It's symbolic of Batman. Bruce Wayne can only be freed from the memory of his parents and the torture of the memory of his parents by becoming Batman. That's essentially what this page is telling you. And I think it's really effective. And it's using the grid in that composition. So I think this is an excellent example of using the grid as you go, but there are other forms of art that use grids as well. This is just a simple layout of abstraction on a grid design. This is based on a grid, but it's a grid that goes in a circular manner to the center. But there's little quadrants for each of these things, and you can see the patterns that is created by those grids. Architecture uses grids all the time. All cathedrals are laid out on similar grids. The grid is used heavily in web design. When they're designing a page, there's a grid to follow, and that grid is usually repeated from link to link within your website. And that's so if somebody is going through your website, when they click to the next page, it'll be based on the same grid, so it'll still make sense. And that repetition will make them so they don't have to learn how to read the second page after they've been to your landing page. It's the same with books. If you have, and you've probably seen it in textbooks, textbooks are laid out, it could be like a 3-column grid or something like that with the pictures all in the same place. And what that does is it allows consistency from page to page. And when you lay that out on a grid, people don't have to learn how to read each page individually. They get the layout on the first page and then they flip to the next page and it's the same layout. So they're like, oh, okay, it's the same layout. I can just read this the same way I read the first page. So basing things on a grid will give you consistency as well. This is a painting that's based on a grid. This is by an artist named Chuck Close. He did this, I believe, in the early 70s or the late 60s. It might be 71. But what he does is he takes a photograph, he grids it out, and he paints each individual grid square to create a realistic composition. Now, he has that condition where he cannot recognize faces. So it would be impossible for him to paint this if he didn't use a grid system, which is very interesting. Now, something tragic happened to him. He had some condition where he woke up paralyzed. So this is how he has to paint now. He was really capable of realism back then. But this is still realism, but it's done with a grid. And if you look, you can see each individual grid square, and he'll divide this up into a grid. And then he'll do a little abstract painting in each of these squares, just looking at what they are individually as far as color mixing goes. And this is optical color mixing. We don't really talk about that in this class. But when he paints each individual abstract painting, it eventually becomes the face. And again, he can't recognize faces, so he has to use that grid to make things happen. And there's the same type of grid, but turned sideways. This whole room is based on this grid composition on the far wall. This is based on a grid too. You can see the grid underneath, and you would think about it as each of these individual circles repeating all the way out to the edge. And you can see, and you can imagine those circles continuing and creating a nice grid system. What that does, along with this, this title that goes around it, it's framing, being the framing element for the figure, and it keeps you within the compositions. So the grid is containing the composition in this. And he's stuck to the grid with these 2 eye things, which is pretty interesting because he's incorporated the figure along with the tessellations that are created in the grid. These are all based on grids. A lot of designs were, but within the grid, they stretched divisions out here. So we're going to talk about that in a few minutes, but that relates to your assignment. This is a grid that expands in the center. It's a center expanding grid. If you shake your head back and forth, it kind of moves around. This is a tessellation that's based on a grid. It's a repeating pattern that can repeat infinitely. That's what a tessellation is. This is based on a grid. You can kind of see, like, this is divided up into perfect squares. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's a 9x5 grid, 45 grid squares. And the design is laid out on that grid. I think it makes it pretty fun. This is the same thing. Works the same way. This is a center compressing grid. This is kind of a 2D grid, or 3D grid, I'm sorry. This is based on a grid, but the grid is modified as we go in. And this relates to the last assignment. And these rugs are all based on a grid system. You can see the divisions in this grid system. It's a repeating pattern, and they're approximately the same size. So there's an underlying grid to this rug itself. So you can use the grid to really be organized in your compositions, and they work quite well. You can break the rules of the grid. You can break outside the confines of the grid after you establish the grid itself. And the common one we use in traditional art and photography is the 3x3 rule of thirds grid. So if you have any questions about this, let me know and send me an email. Otherwise, we'll get on to what the next assignment is. I'm going to stop my share for a moment. So the final assignment is the grid assignment. I'm going to open the assignment file. Now, all these files are going to be the shared folder, and I will post the video on YouTube. But we're going to go through the assignment sheet right now. So let me share my video again, or share my screen again. Just going to share the whole screen this time. So project 6 is the grid. This is the last assignment that we're going to do. It'll be due on the last day of class, and it's worth 200 points. So grids are a proportional system used widely by graphic designers and visual artists of all type. They're a structural basis for organization, and that's basically what I'm talking about here. They consist of 2 or more periodic patterns overlaid, usually at right angles, 90 degrees, but sometimes at varying angles, like I showed you in that Chuck Close painting. In 2-dimensional flat design, grids form a structure, scaffold, or skeleton upon which to organize shapes, lines, and marks. And we've been through that. I want you to read through all this, but I want to go through the assignment now. So every grid does not need to divide a surface in an easily recognizable way, and each form should have a clear relationship with every other form. So the main characteristic of the grid is clarity. We're using the grid to make a really organized and sensible composition. Grids can be created that are complicated yet clear. So this grid assignment is a 2-part assignment, and you have to read the instructions carefully. And I'm going to go over them right now. So the first part of the grid design or assignment is to complete a number of grid designs in your sketchbook. Now these sketchbook grids, they don't have to be inked. I want you to draw them by hand though. That's the big thing with this assignment. A lot of you have been doing digital art up until now. The grids have to be hand drawn, and they're going to take some time. So you need to start this right away. Okay. So you're going to draw a list in your sketchbook. And a lot of people don't read through this clearly, so they just copy what they see here. But there's a list of all the things you have to draw. Actually, no, I think I've rewritten this, so it's very clear. So the first part of your grid assignment is complete the types of grids shown. You're going to draw them in your sketchbooks. You're going to draw them in pencil. I do want you to color them in. You're going to do 2 more motifs or tessellations. And again, a tessellation is a repeating pattern that can repeat infinitely. That you could use in a large grid and do a sample periodic grid, and that's what this is, with 3 motifs by 3 motifs. So you're going to do a 3 by 3 grid, and each square is going to have a pattern in it of some point that's a repeating tessellation. They should look similar to this. And I'm going to go through this, so don't be nervous about it. You're also going to do 1 progressive overlapping grid that is 1 inch tall that expands out with as many divisions as you like. So this is 1 inch tall, and you'll look that this grid expands as we go out, but it also overlaps. So this shape here is here, but it's being overlapped by the grid. So it gives you the impression of something being overlapped. You're going to do a compressing and expanding grid using the Fibonacci series of numbers that is 3 inches tall with as many divisions as you like. So you can either make it expand in the center or contract in the center. These are center compressing grids. And I'll go through those in a few minutes. And I'll go through what the Fibonacci series of numbers is. Number 4, you're going to construct a center compressing grid starting with a 1 inch by 1 inch grid or a 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch squares in the center. And it's going to expand out in the 4 directions. And you're going to expand it out 5 divisions. So this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's going to expand out 5. Then you're going to construct a 1 inch corner curve and a 1/2 inch corner curve, both on the same grid. Then you're going to construct a spherical shaped grid, which is basically a sphere with a grid in it. You're going to construct a star-shaped grid, and then you're going to do 1 irregular grid. The constructions can be done in your sketchbook, and they should be done in pencil. And you need to turn these in. You're going to have to turn them in the shared drive along with your grid composition. Now, how I want it arranged in the shared drive is a folder that says the grid on it, and then your final composition, and then your 8 constructions in a folder called Sketchbook. So you can turn it in like that. If you have any questions about that, let me know. Then the second step for your grid will be your final project for the class. You're going to complete one 12-inch by 12-inch grid base composition on a 13 by 13-inch poster board. Your final grid, and you can use any poster board you want. You can buy the cheap stuff at Walmart. Just make sure when you're drawing on the poster board that you're not drawing on the shiny side. You want to draw on the matte side. Your final grids will be a combination of various types of grids that you have constructed, and that's these. It's going to be a combination of all these. And you can use tessellations in these grids as well, and I'll go through some examples in a minute. Let's see. So you have to have at least 3 planes of grids to create depth, and at least 4 of the following types of grids: periodic, compressed, expanded, progressive overlapping, spherical, star-shaped, or invented. Invented must have 3D qualities. I don't want it to be full of invented grids because that's really not that precise, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So you can use invented grids, and it can even be your focal point, but I don't want the whole thing just to be hand-drawn grids. I want you measuring and figuring things out. So you're going to decide the shape, size, and placement of these grids based on the elements of art and organizing principles. And basically how I want you thinking about this is simple shapes first. We're going general to specific. We're breaking it down to its essential form. So when we look at some of these examples, you would think corner curve before you think about the pattern within the corner curve. You would think the star-shaped grid and the shape of that star-shaped grid before you think about the pattern that's in that grid. Now the patterns will create value as well, and we'll talk about that a little bit more too. So think about your gestalt, create focal points. There needs to be focal points. You need at least a primary and a secondary, and then other focal areas within the picture. We need to be moving around your composition. So you also have to think about your directional forces. You got to think about rhythm and what the repetition of these shapes will do. And if you interrupt this, you're going to create a focal point. You need to include areas of interest and balance. You need areas with places for the eye to rest. So you can have a calm area. It doesn't have to all be filled with pattern. Like these big white circles here are giving our eye a chance to rest with the busyness of the patterns next to it. So follow your instincts. You may use 2 values other than black and white if you want to bring them into your grids. And I have some student examples that are newer than the ones on the assignment sheet here. Please refer to the following examples and the examples I will put in the shared folder. Ask questions if you have them. Contact me by email. If you need to, you can call me. So I just want to show you a few things here. There's really good overlap. And remember, we need depth in your picture. So you're going to create 3 planes, at least 3 planes to create depth. And what you can do with those planes is if you spread the value out and you have large portions of white, it's going to read as hierarchy. If you make a tighter grid that's more compressed, it'll read as darker. If you have a large one that's predominantly black, it'll read as darker too. So I want you to notice the different values and how that contrast can push these forward in space. And if you have less contrast, like these are very close in value when you squint at them, that doesn't feel like it's out as far forward as this. I hope that makes sense to everybody. There's really good directional forces. There's areas for the eye to rest. There's strong focal point in this one and this one. Primary is secondary. But you can get some really wide arrangements. And you can also put like a clean grid within some organic lines. There's just a ton of things you can do. You can also put a framing element to create the Gestalt principle of containment. There's some effective grids in there, but I have more examples to show you that are more recent too. So let me close this down. Now I'm going to go through, and I have Photoshop files here, but I'm going to go through each step. So the first step is we're going to do 2 3x3 grids filled with tessellations. And it's just called a periodic grid. I want to make sure you all can see this. So here's the two 3x3 grids, and I made different different patterns on layers. So what you're going to do is you're going to start with your grids, and you'll draw those out. And this is just a 3" by 3" grid, and that's what you should do in your sketchbook. You need to measure these with a ruler, and you need to make them clean because it's going to be practice for the final. So you're going to do one grid square with a pattern in it. Your pattern can be anything you want. Now I want to show you how to divide up a square so you can figure out quadrants within the square. If you put an X across a square, from corner to corner, this will be the exact middle of your square. So if you want to make some kind of pattern, you can base it on this X. And you can keep dividing the square. So this intersection of the X is the halfway point on the horizontal and the halfway point on the vertical. And you'll see when I did that, I divided the square into 4 squares now. So there's another halfway point. Whoops. Here, when I divide that up. So I could fill these in and create a pattern just with that. It's very simple to do, and it'll be the same every time if you're using that technique. So if I do that, and then if I fill in some of those squares, and erase the other lines in it, you can make a fairly complex pattern and repeat that shape over and over. So I'm going to erase this. And this is what that first one looks like with a repeated pattern. It creates value, and you got to think about the pattern creating visual interest and value. And then the second one looked like this. So it's a repeated pattern over and over. So that's the first one. It's easy. It doesn't matter what grid pattern you put in there. I don't mind if you keep it simple for your sketchbook examples, but I want you to think creatively about patterns that you can make. Some people, to put an even pattern in things, will take like a coin or something they have at home and trace it in each square. So like if I had a dime, I could line it up like to this edge of the square in each square. Have a little space on this side, but that pattern will still repeat over and over. Hope that makes sense to everybody. So that's the first one. The second one we're going to do is a progressive overlapping grid. And again, it's the big shape that gets overlapped by the grid. So what you want to do is draw out the largest proportion. And the way you make these proportions is that this is 1.5 inches, I believe. This is 1.25 inches. This is 1 inch. This is 3/4 inch, 1/2 inch. Actually, I think this is 1.75 inches. But it gets smaller as we go. And I'm just taking a 1/4 inch off every time. So I start with the full shape in that quadrant of the grid. And then the second shape I'm going to draw is going to be this exact same shape to this proportion, but I'm going to stop drawing it at the edge of the grid square there, or the grid line there. So you'll see it's cut off. It looks like it's being overlapped. And what we're actually looking at is a shape that continues. I've measured out the shape completely, but I've only drawn it up to that line. Then we continue doing that. And again, this is the same shape, has the same arc. And if you drew it completely, it would extend out to the full length. But as we go, it gets smaller. All right, so that's the second thing you're going to draw. The third thing you're going to draw is a compressing or expanding grid. You can make it either expand or compress as you go to the middle. So the first thing you want to do is you want to draw a vertical line when you're making this grid. And that's the straight up vertical. Then you're going to draw horizontal lines. And this is 3 inches tall. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this a center compressing grid. And with this, I was making, I think this is a 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch, inch. Oh no, I'm sorry. This is based on the Fibonacci sequence. Let me explain what this Fibonacci sequence is. So the Fibonacci sequence is a way you can expand things out mathematically to give a pleasing expansion. So it's based on these numbers, 1, and then, actually I'm going to type them so they're easier to read. So we're going to start with 1, and then 2. And then when you get to 2, it's this number plus this number equals the number that follows. So 1 plus 2 is 3. 3 plus 2 is 5. Oops, that's a 4, 5. 5 plus 3 is 8. 8 plus 5 is 13. So it's always the number and the previous number creates the next number. Now what this does is it creates a sequence of numbers that I can multiply by a unit of measurement. So if I'm starting with a 1/4 inch, it would be 1/4 inch, okay? This would be 2 1/4 inches, 3 1/4 inches, 1 1/4 inches, 2, and let's see, 3 1/4. So you're going to multiply this, and it doesn't matter what measurement you multiply it by. It could be millimeters, it could be miles. This could be 1 mile, 2 miles, 3 miles, 5 miles, 8 miles, 13 miles. This could be 1 inch, 2 inch, 3 inch, 5 inch, 8 inch, 13 inch. But for the sake of this grid, multiply this by a 1/4 inch. And then you'll see that it expands out in a pretty nice, pleasing way when you get out from the center. So I'm going to turn that off. So I'm going to measure a 1/4 inch, and then 1/2 inch, and then I multiply it by 3, 3/4 inches, and 5 1/4 inches, so it's 1 1/4 inches, and then 13. I multiply it by 13. So you're going to have that grid, and then you're going to put a pattern within that grid. And the way that's going to look is like this. And the way I did this pattern is I drew in half. And all this is dividing the triangle from corner to corner. And it looks like it compresses as it goes to the center. And that's it doubled up. Actually, I have a cleaner version of that doubled up. So I hope that makes sense to everybody. You could also do it in the opposite direction. You could measure this large proportion in the center and get smaller as you go out. And it would look like it's expanding in the center. So it would be coming towards us instead of going in. And you can draw it either way you want for that step. Now this one's going to be going in all 4 directions. It's essentially the same as before, but you're going to draw a vertical and horizontal axis. And I believe I used the Fibonacci sequence. I may have done it just in 1/4 inches here. I don't know until we draw it in. But you're going to draw, if you draw that center axis, the vertical and horizontal, once you do the measurements, you're going to measure up this line in all 4 directions. And then you're going to draw a line straight across. And if you draw those lines straight across, essentially the grid will build itself. So for these first 2 lines, I measured a 1/4 inch here and a 1/4 inch here. And I drew those lines straight across through it. And then I did the same thing vertical. So I went from the center axis and I measured a 1/4 inch here and a 1/4 inch here and drew the vertical lines. So you're starting to get a grid in there. And then I made my measurements. This is a 1/2 inch, 1/2 inch, and that is from this to here. So 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, just like we did on that horizontal grid. But now we're doing it in all 4 directions. 3/4 inch. An inch. So then I drew these out. And essentially, I have a grid in there that compresses as you go to the center. Now, once I started filling the pattern in, what I did is I just started drawing lines from corner to corner. In each quadrant, like if you split this up into 4 from the X and Y axis, you got one here, you got one here, you got one here, and you got one here. I started drawing lines just from corner to corner, going in all 4 directions from the center. And you'll see that happen here. 1, 2, 1, and it goes through. Then I did it in the vertical. And then I just colored in half of those to create the pattern. and the pattern looks like this. And if you look, this pattern looks like it's compressing towards the center. So that would be a center compressing grid. That's another one you have to draw. You could do expanding if you want to. I'm not going to be particular about that. Oh, no, you have to draw a center expanding grid. So here we go. That's one of the steps as well. Same idea here. Oh, no, you don't. Okay, for that one, that number 4 is either center compressing or center expanding. You don't have to do 2. You have to do one or the other. Then you're going to do corner curves. And corner curves are based on a grid, but it's going to look like this. And you're going to go down the sides. You're going to do one curve this way, and you're going to do one curve on top. So the corner curve, this is split. This is a 1 by 1 square, and this is equal 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So it's 7 by 7 grid. And I broke these two axes up into ½ inches. So I'm measuring ½ inch on each inch square. And I did it in both directions. Now, how you draw it out once you get that measured is like this. So we got that grid. We're going to draw the first line. And the line's going to go from the corner. It's going to start in the corner, and it's going to go to the first tick here. I think you probably did this in geometry class in high school or even grade school, but if you don't remember or you didn't, this is how you do it. So we draw that line from the corner there. Then we move up a tick here, and then we move up a tick here. So it's going to go from here to that edge of the grid square. And as we draw new lines, we're going to keep coming down ½ inch and going up ½ inch. I'm going to keep adding those. And you'll see eventually when you draw all those lines out, it's going to create a curve. So we get that curve there. And this is just drawing straight lines from ½ inch to ½ inch and going up or going down and going across. Okay. So that's the ½ inch by ½ inch. And then I did the same thing here, just with the inches instead of the ½ inches. And then I came up with this curve. And this is all made from straight lines. Now there's something I want you to notice about these curves. The more divisions you have, the smoother the curve is. This is a little rougher. It's kind of a bumpy curve. So depending on the proportion of your grids or your lines themselves or your spacing, it's going to change what the picture looks like or the grids themselves look like. Now you can fill that in with pattern. Now with this, I just put a checkerboard pattern in, but it starts looking pretty good. So I put a checkerboard pattern there. When you're making pencil lines, you got to keep organized and figure out where your grid squares are, because the 1 inch by 1 inch squares no longer apply once we get outside or inside this line. It's all these modified, like warp squares that are caused by drawing those straight lines. So I filled those in, okay? Now to bump this up and create depth, this also already looks like it has depth because we have contrast created by the pattern here and the pattern here, and it sits out ahead of the pattern behind. But you can create a lot of visual interest by filling that back grid with a pattern too. You don't have to do this in your sketchbook, this part of it. You do have to draw the 2 corner curves, but filling this grid in behind is something you should think about in your final project, but you don't have to do it for the sketchbook. So this is the grid filled in. Like if I have it grayed out, it creates contrast, these pop forward. If I make it full value, it gets really busy and reads really flat, but I still like it. But that repetition and the depth can change with the values themselves. So that's something else you can think of when you're filling in patterns behind everything. So that's corner curves. You got to draw 2 of those, a ½ inch and a 1 inch. Then you're going to do a spherical grid. And this is where your compass comes into play. Now we're also going to draw a center axis like we did the first time. You're going to figure out the vertical center and the horizontal center. And then we have to measure up in each direction of the line. So I made, I believe this is 1 inch, 3/4 inch, ½ inch, and a 1/4 inch. And that's all you need to do for your sketchbook. You don't If you get too big, it'll go off the edge of your sketchbook and you won't be able to use your compass. So you measure it in all 4 directions, the same proportions. Now what you're going to do is you're going to take your compass, you're going to find a spot on this axis. I believe it's around here, where the pencil of the compass will be here, the needle of the compass will be here, and you're going to draw an arc that'll end past this. It's going to end above this. It should be like a 1/4 inch above it. So when you draw that in, turn these down a minute. You're going to see this one ends actually out here, but there's some space between this last tick because this is where the edge of the circle is going to be and the arc itself. If it ends right here, if you bring this arc and find a place where your compass will hit that arc, it's going to look like a weird eyeball. So you want to make sure it's ending above that line. But then you're going to draw that same arc. You're just going to move up the needle of the compass and the pencil of the compass with the same distance between the point of the compass and the pencil as that you did with that first line. And you're going to draw arcs through all 4 ticks. So here we go. Then you're going to keep that same compass proportion. You're going to line the pencil up here and you're going to put the needle wherever it falls here. And you're going to draw it all 4 in that direction. Then you're going to do the same thing. You're going to line the pencil up with this one here and the needle here. And then you're going to draw through all 4 ticks with the same proportion, the same distance between the needle and the pencil on your compass in this direction. And you're going to draw it in this direction. Now, once you get that done, all you have to do is put the needle of your compass in the center and your pencil on the furthest most tick and draw a circle, and you'll create a circle around these things. That looks like this. And once you have that, you can see the checkerboard in there, or you can see the grid in there. Now, I'm not looking for you to make this perfectly round. There's some precise measurements you need to make it perfectly round. That's not the goal here. It's just to put a grid pattern inside a circle. And all I did was fill in a checkerboard pattern. You could get more creative with the pattern itself, but that's what it looks like in the end. Now, keep in mind when you're doing your final design, you want to draw these grids out in pencil and then ink them, but you got to be organized about it. You got to think it through. So that's the spherical shaped grid. And again, like, you don't have to be perfectly neat on the sketchbook ones. They can be done in pencil. I want you to power through these so you can get to the final grid design. You have 3 weeks to do it. Here's the star-shaped grid. So all a star-shaped grid is it's corner curves that we did in the earlier step, but the back end of them are butted up against each other. So what we've done is we've drawn a center axis. These are all 1/2 inch divisions up the line, and you do that in all 4 directions, equal number. And then you're going to draw 1 corner curve, 2 corner curves, 3 corner curves, and then 4 corner curves, and then you have that star-shaped grid. Now, something I want to point out, if you were to measure 1/2 inch up this line and then 1 inch up the other line, that would make, and you did an even amount of measurements, that would make a different proportion for your grid. And I have a grid drawn like that. This is what the pattern looks like filled in with this. But this is, I think these are 1/4 inch measurements along this line and then 1/2 inch along this line. And when you connect those lines the same way we did the other corner curves, it looks stretched out. So you can modify these corner curves as well. You could also give them more axis. So you could have some diagonals come out of here, measure the measurements up those diagonals, and you'll get kind of a multi-pointed star that way. So you can really do that. And there are some of those in the examples. Just take a look at the examples that I'm going to show you. So that's a star-shaped grid. You got to draw one of those. Then you draw an irregular grid. And what an irregular grid is, just creating a shape and faking a grid in it. You want to try to show, it's like using cross contour lines in drawing. You're trying to show dimensions of the object, but you're just making up the grid on the inside of it. That's why I don't want your composition to be full of irregular grids. There's no measuring involved in this. It's not very meticulous. And if you do that, like, you're kind of robbing yourself on like basing things on a grid itself. So those are what you have to do for your sketchbook. I hope that all makes sense. And you can get to that. Now I'm going to go through the student examples to show you and talk about those a little bit and good elements in those. So I have to open those real quick, so bear with me. My objective for showing you these is just going to point out some interesting stuff. I believe all the ones in here are A work. But there's some really nice elements in some of them. And I'll point out some flaws in them as well. I'm also trying to stall here while Photoshop opens. There we go. Share my screen with you. So what you can see is when you start overlaying the grids with one another, you get quite a complex looking arrangement. Now, everything we've used so far, line, shape, value, texture, color, and the assignments we did are leading up to this. We were thinking about line, we were thinking about shape, we were thinking about Gestalt principles, we were thinking abstractly, just simple shapes. We talked about pattern, and we talked about texture. There's not going to be any texture in this, or actual texture, because of the fact that it's just a two-dimensional drawing done with marker. But this is what you're going to do for your second step. So this is a 12 by 12 grid on a 13 by 13 piece of poster board. And it's a really nice arrangement of objects. There's really good depth in this one. There's really good overlap in this one. And there's a couple of interesting things that I want to point out. There is a very clear focal point. They surrounded the focal point with that value and gave us a really open area for us to breathe in, so we can concentrate and actually see the focal point. This is a very good arrangement. There's also a really good directional force created with this line that goes back into space and behind this grid here. This is a really good element that leads us into the composition and it keeps us within the composition itself. So there's a nice arrangement of things in this picture. In this one, and this is actually, I'm going to adjust the brightness and contrast. This has layers of depth, and interesting layers of depth, because she just drew a grid out on top of things to create one layer of depth and didn't even put a pattern in it. I like the black behind everything. It creates high contrast. And because of the white here, this feels like it's far away from this black behind it. There's really good depth in this image. There's a center compressing grid in the middle. There's a bunch of circular grids. So this follows all the requirements in the assignment sheet, and it's really effective the way it does it. Now, the focal point could be a little more obvious, but it's not too bad. Here's another one, very obvious focal point, really good directional forces. Nice change of value here to give it almost a light source coming through, but there's good depth as well and clear focal points. And this is an example of those star-shaped grids, but there's more access to it rather than just the vertical and horizontal. This one has some nice, this is not that great a design overall, but the patterning in it and the grid itself is nice. And there's some really nice tessellations in it. This one has good depth to it. This has a few too many irregular grids, but it does follow what was needed to be done. You can see some errors in the drawing. Now, eventually that may happen to you. If you fail to draw a grid square in or accidentally get it wrong, don't panic about it. I know these are hand drawn, but I want you to do your best to be as organized as possible about it. Oh, I just closed one. This one has some very nice patterning in the background compared to the foreground. Now, this is done before I allowed them to use grayscale markers. If this had a gray value in the background, or there was within each square, there was a grid behind the tessellation, so you could make like a checkerboard in there, it would read as a different value and offset these shapes a little better. But because it's spread out, and if you squint at it, all the values across this created by the patterns are approximately the same, so it flattens out quite a bit. It could be a deeper composition. This is an interesting one. This is the minimum possible of grids, but they're all there, and there's really good overlap and really obvious focal point. I think this is really good, but the repetition of form brings us around the picture plane too. So we see this, and we see this, and it relates to it, but these relate to that, even though the tone's reversed. But it makes us jump around, and there's really good directional forces throughout this one. And I like the fact that they create little quadrants that all relate to each other and they work together. But there's nice little sections for us to stop and concentrate on. This one's excellent. Clear focal point because it's the only orb in the clear. Everything else, well, this one is, but the other ones are interrupted. This one's smaller, and this is emphasis by dominance. There's really good directional forces. They took that compressing grid and just made the lines curved instead of straight, still measured it out, and built her, she built her pattern in that grid according to the curve. And I think it's really effective the way she did that. It creates really good depth. This one I like a lot. I like the fact that this circle is blank. It gives us a clear focal point, and it also gives us something to really concentrate on. And then there's really good directional forces. And these are just lines that are leading us back into the picture plane. And the grids are there as well. So I think this one's very nice. This one's good too. There's good focal point. There's a lot of stuff leading out from that focal point. I wish there were a few more technical grids in here because, well, this one's measured along that curve. So I think this is really good. But this is just, I don't even think this one was measured. Now, a way you can measure along a curve is get a piece of string and you lay that string out straight, and you can mark your ½ inch, ¼ inch, or ¼ inch, ½ inch, ¾ inch, whatever you want along it. And then you can take that string and lay it around along the curve you've drawn and make the ticks where those measurements go with the string. So it's just a little thing for you to think about. There was one more that I accidentally closed that I want to find here real quick. Oh, this one I like a lot. I like the open space. I like the stuff going. I don't know. I have a problem with the open space, but I still think it's pretty effective. I think it works pretty well. So this is a nice composition. And I didn't mark them down from the open space, but there's really nice grids in there. Use of grids. I wish this is black here. I wish this one was black instead of gray. I think it would be more effective if it was, or this one was gray instead of black, vice versa, so they relate more to one another. But I still think it's a very effective composition. That's the last one I have to show you. So what I want you to do is I want you to do your stuff in your sketchbook as quick as possible. You should be able to take care of that in a day or less. And then I want you to get started on your grid design. Now, when you're designing your grid, I want you to draw little squares to figure out the main shapes you're going to put in the grid. You can save the measurements for later on, but you want to be working in a square format when you're doing your thumbnail drawing so you can really plan out the composition. And then build it from there. And when you're building it, I would start with a pattern that's in the background, and then I would place my objects on top of that. Now that pattern in the background, I would measure the grid out. It could be a ½ inch by ½ inch or whatever. You could have some curved grids, whatever you want to do in the background. But I would draw it lightly in pencil first and then put the other grids on top of it and start building those. And then I would ink it from the background forward, but wherever a grid interrupts it, I wouldn't ink that part until I get the pattern in the background and then put the patterns on top. So work from the background forward, but be very careful about your measurements and figuring out where your grids go before you actually push hard and get really dark lines in there. If you have any questions, please email me. Your assignment, your value assignment is due today, so make sure it's in the folder. I'll be sending you individual critique on that. I'm not going to grade that one hard because we usually do a Photoshop assignment, and this is taking place as a Photoshop assignment. But yeah, I'll give you commentary on that. So if you have any questions, email me. Feel free to call me if you want. My number's on the syllabus. If I don't answer right away, I'll call you back. And I hope you're all having a good day, and I will see you all soon.